So today we're going to talk about still life. As you can see, the essential question is, how can I create a proportional still life composition that utilizes the rule of thirds and is unified in color value? Like all the other assignments, you can see the link to the Cornell notes on the bottom right. Again, we always suggest to take some notes on whatever we're talking about so that you can refer to those later and use them on any quizzes that we might have in class. The learning targets for this unit are: I can create a still life utilizing the rule of thirds. I can create a proportional still life drawing utilizing one of the drawing media choices in the classroom. Those are chalk pastel, oil pastel, or gouache, but you should use a different media than you've used before. The last learning target is I can utilize the value techniques to create color value in my drawing that is unified both in color and value and has enough contrast to see all the objects. So really, for this assignment, we are actually utilizing everything we've learned the whole semester in order to create something even stronger than before. So we're not actually in a Pear Deck here, but we're asking, how will using a resource artist help strengthen your still life drawing? So if you were thinking about the strong work Venn diagram, which are the rule of thirds and elements and principles, experimenting with media and techniques, and then using some sort of cultural commentary or communicated idea. Hopefully you can see that when we ask you to look at resource artists, really what we're trying to do is get you inspired by the work that somebody else did. And perhaps you might even figure out a communicated idea or something more novel that you hadn't thought about before, whether it's a color scheme or the objects they were using or their light source or some other kind of cultural commentary that you want to talk about in your work. The cultural commentary is not that big a deal, but at this point, we always ask you to look at resource artists in order to learn something new that you haven't learned before. As we move on, we're talking about that design process like we have every time that we create something. So we are in the think mode. We are trying to figure out what we're doing for still life. Shortly, we will start making the still life. We'll actually look at the still lifes that are in front of us on the tables in the classroom. And then so when we're doing something in process like that, it's always an in-process critique or a review or a reflection. We're giving each other feedback on what we could do to improve our work. That is also something that we're doing in our digital portfolios. Remember, you are supposed to be taking process photos of the work that you're doing. Here you can see the person actually used a collage first, then they blocked in their images, and then they started creating the value in their images. As you are reflecting on the work that you've done, you're actually going to use the design process standards to do that. Again, those are linked in the submission module for you. And you really should be highlighting any terms that you're using along the way. I say highlighting because a lot of times bolding them, like what was done in this middle section, is not enough to really see the terms that you're using. And then the last thing, again, is you're going to be comparing your work to a resource artist. So hopefully you can see how this work that the person did, it was using complementary colors and they are using reflections in their work. And you can actually see the artist that they chose, Janet Fish. She's actually a watercolor artist and she does things with reflections and almost complementary colors. You can see that there's purple or violet used in the lower parts, and then there was like a yellowish green, whether those are apples or pears, I can't really tell on this. I think they're apples. But they are yellow-green, and so yellow and violet are complementary colors. This is actually a split complementary color scheme, but the person, when they created theirs, they actually did a complementary color scheme. It's close enough, and again, we are comparing and contrasting with our resource artists, so it's fine if it's not exactly the same. The point is to be inspired by what somebody else is doing. So if we think about still life objects, how are those similar to things that we've already created? If we think about the first composition drawing that we did and then the perspective drawing, which were the larger drawings that we did in this class, what are some of the concepts that are the same? So in the still life, there are going to be rounded and square objects. There will be value added to your larger drawing. There might be some reflections. If you select things that have glass or glaze on them, you'll actually see highlights reflected from the lights in the classroom or from the windows in the classroom. And then there will be some similar design requirements that we've had before. Now taking a look at the requirements for our drawing, we definitely want to do 5 thumbnail sketches. The reason that we do 5 is we're going to select whatever the strongest of the thumbnail sketches is. What I do like about this zoomed in version though is it's really utilizing all of the page. So if you look at requirement number 2 of having to fill the entire picture plane or your paper with your still life drawing, that is one of the requirements, and you will lose points if you don't fill the page, just so that you are aware. The third requirement is using the rule of thirds and having an emphasis that is not in the middle of the page. The last and most important requirement that you can see is all in caps is creating unified color value throughout the drawing. Here you can see the person used a viewfinder. It's just a picture of blocking out parts of the still life. So if you imagine, if you're using a viewfinder, remember the viewfinder is that piece of paper with the square hole cut in it. Part of the reason that you use a viewfinder is to find what your composition would look like. So this part on the outer edge here is actually blocking out some of the objects that are in the still life. And what you're seeing, those objects that are stronger, they're more bold in the black outlines, that is what your composition would actually look like. So again, we probably don't want to draw the entire still life. You want to draw maybe 3 or 4 objects and kind of zoom in on it. It's going to fill your page for you, and it's going to create a more interesting still life as well. When we are talking about drawing or blocking things in, you always want to use the analog clock face to compare the angles of where different objects are in the still life, specifically the objects that are cubes. A lot of the different things are on top of boxes that we've covered with some cloth, but there may be some square objects that you still have to actually draw in the composition, and using that analog clock face to get diagonal lines going the right direction is important. Again, when you're blocking in, you want to think of taking a math graph so that you can draw what you have in different quadrants. Whether you're drawing from a thumbnail sketch or you're actually drawing from a photograph that you took of the still life, it doesn't really matter, but you're dividing either the printed photograph or your thumbnail sketch into quarters, and you are dividing your larger page into quarters as well in order to represent what's in one quadrant. So that upper left quadrant of the teapot handle would be in the upper left quadrant of that section that has the graph in it there that you can see. Another thing that you need to think about, and this goes all the way back to when we were doing those cylinders in value, the top of any kind of rounded object is going to look more elliptical or oval when it's tipped away from you. So this milk jug that you're seeing is actually a circle, but you're actually seeing it squished quite a bit because of where it is in perspective, and probably because of how you're sitting in your seat at the table. The same thing with this bottle that's been tipped over, is you can actually see how circles, when they're turned on their sides, they become more of an ellipse. You're not going to draw the entire circle. It's going to be more ovular. So some perspective reminders: as objects go away from you, they are going to get smaller. It's not going to happen quite as dramatically as it did in the perspective assignment, but still, some of the objects that you have in the foreground or the front part of your drawing are going to be smaller than the things that are in the background or farther away from you. We had talked about measuring different things. Measuring in the still life is still important, so you want to take one object and measure it against the others. If we use that cougar head in the upper right again, we're taking the cougar head and measuring it with how long the cougar body is, and you can notice there are 6 cougar heads in the length from the very tip of the cougar's nose to the end of the cougar's tail. There are 6 head lengths of that in that particular item. I am wondering at this point if you guys remember the 4-step drawing process. Can you review that for me? So if we're looking at this, again, the 4-step drawing process is seeing and shape finding. So you're comparing Positive and negative shapes, they should be considered equal in order to draw correctly, especially if you are drawing more intuitively. You are going to draw the shapes that you're seeing. But as you are doing that, you need to compare angles and ratios, and you need to measure the different objects in order to draw objects realistically as they appear in space, the correct proportion. The third step, again, is those major value changes. That's going to be the bulk of what you're doing for this assignment, and then details should be last. So anything's like pattern in the material or highlights in any glasses or the shadows might be another thing that you add toward the end. So here is an example of what a still life looks like. If you actually take a look at this, again, the person was really thinking about where the diagonals go. They were using that analog clock face to get the open boxes and the different angles of the open parts of the box. They were thinking about those ellipses and the fact that circular objects are scrunched as they go away from you, and so you'd actually have an oval. And remember, there's arcs on the bottoms of our cylinders as well. Then the other thing that you need to think about are how wide certain things are, and you're going to use one object to compare the rest of the objects in your still life. So for example, I think this was a toilet paper roll. So if you measure that toilet paper roll, there are about 2 toilet paper sections in the box that is on the right. There are about 2 1/4 in the box that's in the middle, and there are about 2 height-wise of that toilet paper roll to the cylinder that's in the background. And that's actually keeping everything more in perspective. I know you don't see the photograph of that right now, but I'm just trying to give you an example of using one object to actually measure against all the other objects that you are looking at. When we had talked about blocking in, there's a question here on the right of why would you always draw lightly? Really, the answer to that is that you want to be able to erase anything that you make mistakes on without creating a problem when you're creating the value or details later. That's why we draw so lightly when we start. So here you can see a person is blocking in. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to select different objects from the still lives that you see on the table. The instructors put different still lives together for you. If you are not happy with those objects, you can of course bring in some things from home. We will have to set them up in a different area. After that, you are going to be blocking in. You're seeing in shape finding, so you're blocking in with really light lines all of the objects that you see in your photograph, or better yet, the objects that you're seeing on the table. Part of the reason I'm starting to talk about really looking at the objects in real life is you actually get a different feel in your artwork if you draw from life as opposed to if you always are working from a photograph. So if you've always been working from a photograph, you really want to try to start drawing and painting from life. It will be hard at first, but you will get used to it as you continue to do that. The third thing that you want to do is you're going to create color value in your still life. This particular example is using the exact colors of the objects in that still life. You do not have to do a polychromatic still life. What that means is using many colors. You could do a monochromatic version if you wanted to. You could do a complementary version if you wanted to, an analogous version. The color choice and color scheme is up to you, but you will have to use one of the media that's listed here. So you could use chalk pastel, oil pastel, colored pencils. If you have gouache or have used gouache in the past, that's fine. I would not recommend trying a new media for this particular example. You want to use whatever your favorite was of the different medias you used already this semester, because this is your last drawing and we want to feel the most successful with this since we're handing this in for our final exam. When we had talked about value scales, I'm just trying to remind you, you could use different value scales. You do not have to do smudging for this. You could do smudging for part of it and then actually use scumbling or crosshatch or something else to give a different texture to something, to give your drawing a little bit more variety and interest. That would be fine. So again, as a reminder, the line rendering is using parallel lines to create value. Crosshatch is using perpendicular lines to create value. Pointillism is using dots to create value. Again, pointillism takes really long. I would steer away from that unless you're trying to use it as a part of a texture of something. Scumbling is using the side of an implement to create value, or scribbling, and then smudging is using your finger to actually rub the value in. So here are some examples of color schemes. Again, I just talked about monochromatic. It's pointing to that blue guitar on the top, and hopefully you'll notice it's a couple of other things that we have to talk about is the fact that the cool or darker colors are going to recede. So here you can see that darker green recedes underneath the lemons, and it also recedes in the background, as opposed to the yellow and the white, which are the lightest colors in this composition, and they come forward or closer to you. Blues that have white added to them, blues that have black added to them, in order to create that drawing. Polychromatic is pointing to that rock drawing in the upper right, and hopefully you'll notice that particular drawing has all different kinds of colors in it. So unifying all the different colors would be kind of difficult. For example, that particular drawing could have a little bit more of the warm colors in this upper section up here. Again, I'm being kind of nitpicky about that, but that would be one section that probably could have had warmer, maybe a red or an orange rock there, since there's a yellow one right next to it on the right, to improve that drawing. The third color scheme is warm, and you can see those peaches there on the left-hand middle section. The cool color scheme is pointing to that color scheme with the church in the upper portion with the clouds. And the difference between warm and cool is warm color schemes, again, are going to use the yellow, orange, and red, and the cool color schemes are going to use green, blue, and violet. Also, what you need to be aware of is that analogous color schemes are both warm and cool. Okay, they do not necessarily have to be only warm and cool. You could technically use yellow, yellow-green, and green and still have an analogous color scheme, and it's crossing the warm and cool a little bit. The last color scheme that I would suggest is that if you really want to challenge yourself, try doing a complementary color scheme. Part of the reason I'm talking about this is when you mix the complements together, I don't know if you guys remember what you get from that, but you would get either gray or brown as you mix complements. So you do have to be careful when you're trying to create values with a complementary color scheme, because you are going to get some grays or browns that happen, and you will have to resolve some of those things as you are working. But you should be strong enough artists at this point to do that. I'm not sure if you've figured out what color scheme you're going to use yet, but as we continue to talk about this, hopefully you'll think about some of those things. So, some color reminders. I've got a bunch of examples here that I'm going to show you. In order to unify your drawing, you're going to need to use multiple colors in different directions. This happens to be a Monet pastel drawing, and what you should notice is the warm colors in the sky, because it was actually sunrise, but those warm colors are repeated a little bit in the parts of the landscape where the shadows are not. So the sun is sneaking through those haystacks, and you can actually see there's warmer colors used in the grass on that drawing. There are also some warm colors in the haystacks themselves, but what you should notice about those haystacks is they also have the cool colors added to them in order to give them value. And then again, where the shadows are, the cool colors were used for the shadows in this particular example. When I'm talking about unity, notice there's warm colors in the sky, warm colors in the ground, and warm colors in the haystacks. There's also cool colors in the haystacks, cool colors in the shadows, and a little bit of cool color in the sky. And that's really what's unifying this, is using those different colors in multiple parts of the drawing, or repeating it. So a couple of final tips. Again, the shadows and the background for your drawing should be about the same value. So what you'll notice here is where the values get darkest on the objects, and it's actually kind of hard to see the shadows on this, but it's really good that this person used the same dark in the darkest parts of the object that is also in the background. That was a really great thing to do because it unified this entire drawing. This one was actually done in oil pastel. Another thing that you want to think about is different media that you're using. If we're looking at this next still life that a person did, you can see their glasses were on a mirror because they wanted a little bit more of a challenge. They did use chalk pastel for this. And hopefully you can see they're putting a little bit of a darker value in the background. The mirror itself is a little bit lighter pink, so they probably added just a little bit of white to that or selected a pink color that was a little lighter than the red. And then their glasses, they used blues and whites, and they used a lot of white and just a little bit of blue, violet, and even a little bit of green in there to actually create the different interest in the glasses that you see. Another thing that I want to point out with the glasses is hopefully you can see that the glasses themselves are just 1/2 step lighter than the reflections. That is something that's really important, is you want to actually lighten the objects a little bit, because the real life objects, generally speaking, are normally a little bit lighter than the reflections that you see. So if we're thinking about contrast and unity in this one was done in colored pencil on black paper. What this person did is they blocked everything in with a white charcoal pencil, and then they added a colored pencil to create the value on those glasses. They were actually plastic glasses that were set up there. And there was a white, right here, there's a white triangular shape that the glasses were leaned up against. The reason that you're seeing that pattern on that shape is from what the light was reflecting onto that white triangular form through the glasses. Another thing that you should notice about this is that the glasses and the objects were all done with warmer colors, and the shadows and the background were done with cooler colors. The one thing that this person could have done to strengthen this drawing a little bit more, I mean, okay, there are some perspective issues with this glass right here, but the glass over here on the left is really hard to see because they didn't use enough orange and even a little bit of yellow into that glass to push the bottom of the glass a little bit lighter so that we could see it, and so that we could see the front of the glass from the back of the glass. It's really hard to see that one because that person didn't put quite enough value in their drawing. Hopefully you guys can see, as we've talked about those other drawings, what the problem is with this drawing that you're seeing here. If you're saying, oh, the person did not use the value that's in the background in any of the shadows or in any of the object values, you are correct. So if they had actually used the blue or violet that's in the background for parts of the shadows, it would have made this drawing way stronger than it is right now. It's still a pretty good drawing, but adding those blues and violets to other parts of this drawing would have made it even stronger. Here's another leveled up drawing. What this person did is they did a collage, and then they did their drawing on top of the collage, and they actually even rubbed out parts of the oil pastel so that you could see the collage through the oil pastel. There are a couple of areas where the person could have added a little bit darker colors. So for example, in this particular glass, the dark background color could have come through a little bit more, possibly same thing with underneath the actual cups. It would have been smarter to put a little bit more of that value in the shadow underneath the cups. Even though there's a reflection there, you need that separation between the objects that are on the mirror and the objects that are reflected. And again, if we think about the things we had just talked about, what would have made this drawing even a little bit more successful is if the person had used a little bit lighter colors in the teacups. Even though these are glass teacups, they should have used a little bit more whites in the objects themselves and a little bit more of the blues in the reflections. That would have made this drawing a little bit stronger. And then probably pulling some of this darker color around the outside edges would have also helped that. So another thing that we need to talk about is if you're going to use a collage, you want to normally use text collage. Part of the reason I talk about that is as a beginning student, it's really difficult to use pictorial images in your collage and have the still life turn out. So what you're seeing on this image is this larger section was the drawing that the person did during drawing one. And hopefully you can see there's a person's nose right here, and then there's the person's wearing like some sort of leopard print scarf, I believe it was. But it was really hard to see the objects because the person did not put enough value in their drawing. What's ironic about this is the student used this for their AP portfolio later, and they improved the drawing, and that's what I want you to see on the right, is they actually added lighter values in those different objects in order to make the objects more apparent. Now, what did happen is a lot of that collage work was eliminated from the drawing, but you can actually see the objects. So it's still a successful drawing on the right. You'd have to kind of play with that a little bit more in order to get pictorial forms to actually work with whatever it is you're drawing. This happens to be the still life unit, but you could always use collage underneath whatever you're doing. So at this point, you should be able to answer the essential question from earlier and start creating your thumbnails for your still life drawing.